I want to talk a little bit about AI and robotics and where it's going and where it's been, and most importantly, what's driving this technology. Because the reality is that so many things are happening that I could give you a list of all these amazing things that happened yesterday, but tomorrow they're going to be obsolete. So it's very, very hard to keep track of things. So instead of just telling you all the amazing things, I'm just going to go straight to what is driving it. Because if you understand what is driving this technology, what it can and cannot do, you'll have a chance at seeing what the opportunities are. Now, we keep showing you these graphs about linear expectations versus exponentials, and disappointment versus chaos and amazement. All that is true for many technologies, but it is especially true, this time it's really, really real. For AI and robotics, these technologies are moving fast at an incredible pace, and I'm going to show you some real exponentials that sort of dwarf this illustration. And I want to change your thinking from chaos and amazement to stress versus opportunity. My goal today here is to change your mindset from sort of worrying about AI and robotics to seeing all the opportunities to innovate and all the different things we need to do in order to address it. Because the reality is that people have almost a dichotomy in how they think about AI and robotics. Some people are worried about this technology that's going to take over the world. Other people believe that AI is nothing. It's just spreadsheets and data analytics. And sure, it's getting better every year, but it's not going to take over the world anytime soon. So what is it? Is it a technology that's is dangerous for humans, as Elon Musk and Bill Gates often proclaim? Or is AI just data analytics that are going to do nothing? What is it? So the reality is that AI looks like this, like nothing. You cannot see it, you cannot smell it, you cannot touch it, but it is like air. It worms its way into everything, and yet you cannot see it. We already know that AI predicts the weather and AI is governing the stock market, but we've learned in just the last year how AI shapes politics, how AI shapes what we think, our opinions. It shapes what we want, what we buy, what we think we want, what we click on. AI is listening to us. It's talking to us. It is everywhere, and yet you cannot see it. You walk down the street, you don't see AI, you don't see robots, you don't see blinking lights, nothing. It looks the same as it did 50 years ago, and yet AI worms its way into everything we do. It is simply invisible. What I want to do today is give you that lens that will allow you to see AI where other people cannot see it. I want you to see where it is, and I want you to understand and see where it could be. Because those that can see where AI can go are those that lead, and those who cannot see it end up following. And that is the reality. We're all going to go on this ride. The question is, are you going to drive or are you going to be dragged along? But everybody's going to go on the AI ride. It is started going a long time ago, and it's not stopping anytime soon. So let me back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about finances around AI. So this is example, a little bit of data from 1,000 years ago on investments in AI startups here in Silicon Valley by AI VCs. You can see 2010, like the numbers are so small, you can barely see it. 2011 is going down, 2012 going up a little bit. It's almost going nowhere. 2013, 14, but then around 2012, something happens, it begins to inflect, and that these tiny numbers suddenly begin to grow. This is 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, nobody knows. Nobody measures. Every single company claims to be doing AI. Nobody knows what it is, but everybody's doing it. It's impossible to track, to separate out what is AI and what isn't. If you look at other metrics, like the number of publications around AI and machine learning, it's an exponential that is steeper than any of these curves that you've seen before. So it's growing at an incredible pace. I want to give you two quick examples that show you how AI actually infiltrates things that you don't necessarily associate with AI. One example is Amazon Go. I don't know if you've had a chance to shop at Amazon Go. Anybody here? Amazon Go is a supermarket you walk into. There's one in Seattle, one in San Francisco, one in New York. I think there's one or two other places. You walk into, you take anything you want off the shelf and you walk out. No cashiers, no checkout, nothing. You just walk out. In fact, that's on their logo, just walk out. Now, you still pay, but how do you pay? Because there are cameras that line the ceiling and they understand, they can watch what you're doing in the store. Now, these cameras are not streaming to some dude on the other side of the planet that's taking notes. There actually is an AI in the box that understands what you're doing, what you're putting back on the shelf, what you're putting in your pocket, what you're eating in the store. And it charges you for it. Now, I want to use this example because it's an amazing technology but there's also a catch. If you look at this in a simple way, you say, okay, if you're a supermarket owner, you look at this and you say, this is great. I can get rid of my cashiers, which is a lot of headache and a lot of expense, and replace it with this technology, and I get a 20% profit. But there's something deep about this, deeper. What can this technology do that cashiers cannot do? It can tell you not only what people bought, but what people almost bought, what people didn't buy. What were their emotions when they didn't buy something? What did they look at? What were they impressed? How much time did they spend? What did they think about the little new cheese product that you put there? Lots of deep questions here. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ethical? Do you think Amazon can clearly use this information? But I bet you it's not just going to use this information. It is going to sell that information. So I want you to keep that in mind, because when people, the most common question I get from people is, how can I do what I'm doing today using AI? How can I do it cheaper, faster, and better? And that's the wrong question. The question to ask is, what can I do with the AI that I cannot do today at all? And that is the difference, again, between those that move incrementally and those that create entirely new businesses around AI. Lots of questions here. The other example, which you heard about earlier, are driverless cars. Again, a technology that is entirely a product of AI. Nothing else about driverless cars is new except the AI. And that is going to transform everything, not just taxis without drivers and Ubers without drivers, but it's going to transform everything from real estate to e-commerce. Again, an example of how AI worms its way into everything. And I love these two examples because in both of them, the AI is invisible. You walk into Amazon Go, there is nothing, no blinking lights, no robots, nothing. There's just food on shelves. There's nothing, no blinking lights, nothing. You walk into a driverless car, certainly the future ones, there's no dashboard, there's no blinking lights, there's no robots, there's nothing. It's just a seat and you say where you want to go. It becomes invisible when it works, and that is the fascinating angle to it. So I could talk a lot about examples of AI, but I want to focus a little bit on what is actually driving this technology. And there's a couple of things that are coming together to make this move forward in ways that were sort of self-amplifying. Some of these are obvious trends, and some of them are not. So I'm going to talk about 4 drivers. And the first one is obvious, and that is Moore's Law. You've heard a lot about Moore's Law already. Usually we show this chart, but it's an exponential, vertical axis is exponential. It's a log axis, so it looks a little bit deceptive. A log axis, where every tick there is 100-fold improvement, squishes a huge exponential into almost a straight line. But if you plot it on a linear scale, it looks like this. This is real data. This is computing power per dollar today compared to history. This, to me, is quite impressive. You look at this and you can see the rest of history look at where we were 10 years ago. Almost indistinguishable from 1950s compared to where we are today. But before you get too comfortable, let's look at where this curve is going to look like 10 years from today. Now watch the vertical axis as I switch the scale here, bam. This is where we're going to be 2032, and we'll look and laugh at where we are today. Now I want you to marinate in this chart a little bit to understand how fast this is moving forward. The big question is, what are we going to do with computing power that's 1,000 times faster than it is today? What, are we going to download cat movies 1,000 times faster? Or maybe there's something else that we can do with this. And I think the answer is we're going to do more AI. Now, when you look at these exponential curves, everybody uses the word exponential liberally, but I use it mathematically. When I talk about exponentials, I mean a doubling. Exponential has a doubling period. The doubling period of Moore's law is about 18 months. People argue about it, but that gives you a scale. That's what differentiates a true exponential from just any curve that's going upwards. So we'll talk more about these doubling period in a moment, but this is the first reason why AI is moving forward. Now, you could leave this room right now and say, okay, I get it. AI rides Moore's law. Moore's law is exponential, therefore AI is exponential as well. I get it. I move on. But the reality is that this is a tiny piece of the puzzle. So let me tell you what else is happening. And to understand that, the rest of the story, you need to understand how AI actually works. Now, usually, we take 4 years to explain AI, but now I'm going to do it in 60 seconds, just to give you the gist of it. And the reality is there's sort of two ways to build an AI system. The first one is rule-based. The second one is data-driven. Rule-based AI means that you program the computer with a set of conditional rules. In this situation, you should do that. In that situation, you should do this. So for example, if you're a bank and you want a fraud detection system, you hire an expert. The expert tells you that if somebody spends in one day 3 times more than they spent in the previous month, it's probably a fraudulent transaction. The programmer programs this into a computer. The computer can execute this rule on a gazillion transactions a second, and you got a fraud detection system. Bam. Everybody likes it. Customers like it, banks like it, regulators like it, programmers like it, computers like it. Everybody likes rule-based systems. They're easy to understand, to monitor, to improve, to code. Everybody likes rule-based systems. We humans communicate to each other with rules. They're very compact and efficient. There's only one problem with rule-based systems, and that is that a rule-based system is very difficult to improve. To improve a rule-based system, you need better rules. In other words, you need to find a better expert that will give you better rules. And as we know, experts are slow, expensive, and wrong. So where do you get this extra rule from? The alternative is data-driven system where you don't tell the computer what to do, you show the computer what to do. You don't tell it rules for detecting fraudulent system, you give it examples of fraudulent transactions. And the computer can look at these fraudulent transactions, calculate the odds of them happening again based on all kinds of clever statistical signatures, and then it can find more of them. And once it can find more of them, it can learn even more. And it can improve and improve and improve. Data is cheap. In other words, the more it works, the more it can find, the more it finds, the better it gets. And you can smell that exponential. Behind every exponential system, there is a self-improving process. And data-driven systems are self-improving compared to rule-based systems that are stagnant. So for example, if you wanted to make an AI system that would be the world champion in tic-tac-toe, would you do that? Rule-based approach, you'd hire an expert in tic-tac-toe, and they're very expensive, but they're worth it. And they will tell you, here are the 4 rules for winning a game of tic-tac-toe. You should write this quickly. And you would never lose a game of tic-tac-toe in your life. The alternative is you give the computer examples of 100 games of tic-tac-toe from start to end, where the X went, where the O went, who won and who lost. The computer can look at these games, calculate the odds of winning based on statistics, and then given a new situation, it can calculate the odds, and bam, it knows where to go. No rules, no meaning of the game, no philosophy, no strategy, no understanding, nothing. No experts, just examples. And the more it plays, the better it gets. And the beauty of this approach is that it can be applied to anything, even for things for which we don't have rules or experts, like predicting what people are going to buy or where they're going to go, even driving a car. So here I'm sitting in the back of a driverless car being trained in New Jersey. A lot of the training is actually done in New Jersey because Mountain View is too easy. It to drive. New Jersey is where you really learn how to drive. There are 20, this is NVIDIA training the system, there are 20 AIs driving the car. You see these green lines? Looking at the road from 20 different cameras in case one of them doesn't see. I was sitting in the back of a driverless car here and I was asked the guy there, what happens if they disagree about where to drive? I mean, it's bad enough when 2 people disagree. When 20, and they said, when they disagree, they vote about where to go. And that's how they decide. The same thing that plays tic-tac-toe can drive a car. And it's not just a car, it's anything. You want a drone that flies through the woods behind the scenes, this is what it looks like. There are 1,000 AIs looking and making decisions. Like Brad said, there's no ethical dilemma about who to kill, 3 nuns or 4 kids. There's none of that. It's just thousands of AIs calculating with fractions of probabilities, the odds of hitting and not hitting something, and recalculating that every nanosecond based on new data. There's no rule-based system that decides what to do. It's a fantasy that doesn't exist. Here's a decision being made. All right? Now, here's the sad story. Both of these approaches to building AI systems existed in the 50s. 1956, Arthur Samuels from IBM shows a system that beats the world champion in checkers on live TV. TV was barely invented. 1956, IBM stocks go up 50% the next day, 15% the next day. 1957, a year later, Frank Rosenblatt, Cornell University, develops an AI system that is machine learning, data-driven. He has a neural network that he's clutching with his arm, a digital camera with 400 pixels, 20 by 20, digital camera. 1957. And his system learns to recognize objects, whether a triangle, a circle, or a square, not because it has rules. A triangle has 3 corners, a square has 4 corners. No, simply because it's seen examples of these things before. An incredible accomplishment. The New York Times writes, the world is over, machines can learn. 1957. There's excitement everywhere. People start building machine learning systems. It's an incredible accomplishment. There's euphoria in the AI world, and then something terrible happens. The AI community itself swoops in and kills the project. The AI people say, rules rule. Where are you going to get data? How are you going to store data? How are you going to transmit data? This approach is futile. Frank Rosenblatt's career tanks. He dies a few years later, and the world moves on to build rule-based systems because we love rules. We don't like data-driven systems. They're like experience, intuition, emotions. They're opaque. We don't understand how the system makes its decision. We love rules. We can't give up logic. But this equation begins to change as data becomes prevalent. So the second driver of AI is not just Moore's law, but it's a transition to data-driven systems. You see, data is like the fuel, machine learning is like the engine. They're both useless on their own, but you put them together, you take off, and this is that is happening today. There's exponential growth in the amount of data. There's so many charts to show that, cameras and so on and whatnot. The bottom line is that data is fuel that comes from sensor. Data is not your web clicks and your emails. Data is what comes from cameras and audio and air quality sensors and sewage sensors and DNA sensors. Sensors that produce huge amounts of data that is fueling this AI economy. Sensors. Everywhere, sensors. But there's a little bit of a catch. So here's that data growth, and when you ask me, okay, this exponential growth, you might ask me, what is the doubling period of the growth of data? And the answer is about 6 months. In other words, the exponential growth of data makes the Moore's law look like a flat line. compared to the growth of data. But there's a little bit of a catch, and that is that most of this data is what we call unstructured data, the data the AI cannot understand. So unstructured data is like a catch, like a term that that AI researchers sort of blame the data, but the reality is that AI, up until 10 years ago, could not understand most of that data. So even though we had exponential growth, AI could still not understand the data. In fact, even the biggest company with all the computing power and all the data and all the talent could not write software, for example, that would tell the difference between a cat and a dog. Isn't that embarrassing? A cat and a dog? The FBI cannot tell the difference between a cat and a dog? I mean, how embarrassing is that? A 1-year-old child can tell the difference, but no AI company can do that. Now you can say, who cares about cats and dogs? But what about motorcycles and bicycles? If you can't tell the difference between these two, you cannot drive a driverless car down a busy city intersection. Situation was so bad that the AI community decided to crowdsource the solution. They released 1 million images of cats and dogs and said, somebody please figure this out. This is embarrassing. 1 million images of cats and dogs. It wasn't just cats and dogs. There were Superman and sushi and swan and swords and syringes. I don't know who made up these categories, but 1,000 images of 1,000 categories, 1 million images in total. And they said, somebody figure this out. If you can do this, we're going to compete and see who in the world can write software that can understand what's in an image. Now, humans get it right 95% of the time. How well could computers do back in 2010? Competition started 2010, deadline was September 30, midnight Pacific time. I remember that moment. We were all looking at the scoreboard. Everybody competed, big companies, small companies, domestic, international, hackers, universities, startups, and big companies. And the results came in at 75%. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be sleeping in the back of a driverless car that gets it right 75% of the time. That's the fallacy of intelligence. We think that playing chess is an intelligent thing, but actually telling the difference between a cat and a dog is a lot harder than playing chess. It's just that we are so good at it. We don't understand how difficult it is. We've been playing chess for thousands of years, but we've been telling the difference between cats and dogs for millions of years. 2011 comes along, competition is run again, September 30, midnight Pacific time comes along. We're watching the scoreboard and the results come in at 75%. So as we say in New York, Moore's Law, Schmoore's Law. There's something magical about how we humans understand the world. Data, computing power, none of that is enough. There's something else we're missing. There's some magical ingredient. 2012 comes along, September 30, midnight Pacific time comes along. I tell my students, I'm not staying up for this one. Call me if something happens. The result comes in at 74%. It went backwards because they changed the cats and dogs a little bit. Because people were already cheating on the other cats and dogs. But exactly at midnight, suddenly a new software comes in and brings up the error to 84%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to you, but for me, for the AI community, the needle has finally moved on this problem that dogged us for almost a century. It was the Canadians, a group in Toronto that did this. They call it supervision. Americans renamed it to deep learning, which is a better name. They released it open source. This is the only thing you have to remember from this talk, the word deep learning, right? So if anybody talks to you about AI, you let them finish talking, you narrow your eyes, and you say, did you use deep learning? That's what I do. It always works. It's always the right thing to say. All the breakthroughs in AI are deep learning. The Canadians did this. They released it open source. Anybody here from Canada? Thank you, Canada. Released it open source. The next year, everybody copied it. and the results went up to 91% accuracy. It was amazing. Everybody was wondering, will we reach human level performance? That magical number of 95%. 2014, it almost went to 95%. 2015, it crossed the human level performance. 2016, the error was half. Computers are twice as good as humans in understanding what they're seeing. 2017, competition is no longer held. It's too easy for machines to understand what they're doing. We opened up the open source system that the Canadians built, and we found out, to our horror, that they used Frank Rosenblatt's algorithm. We had it all along, except that Frank Rosenblatt had one layer, and he wrote a book that nobody bought. I have a copy. And it said, you have to stack these in layers. Every layer learns a little bit more. The Canadians stacked them 12 layers deep, and they got the result. Today, companies keep stacking them more and more. They make the layers deeper, wider, taller. Google systems today have thousands of layers, but that's why it's called deep learning, because it's not because it's philosophically deep, but because it has many, many layers. And the capacity of these systems, the number of neurons, the layers, and all that is growing at an exponential rate that has a doubling period of 3.5 months. That makes the growth of data look like a flat line. Our ability, the size, the capacity of the brains, these AI brains to extract information, is growing at a faster pace than the growth of data, which in itself makes Moore's law look like a flat line. So today, an AI system can look at an image like this in a nanosecond, tell you there's a dog, a chair, a person, and another chair. And remember, this is an image that has red, green, and blue pixels. It was created for human consumption using an ordinary camera, but a robot isn't limited to seeing the world with red, green, and blue. An AI can see the world with, the broad swath of the spectrum. An AI can see the world at night, at high resolution. AI can see the world with 20 eyes, not with 2 eyes. So this is the worst it's ever going to be. So when you look at driverless cars and you wonder, how is it that suddenly this is possible? We've had cameras and computers in cars for decades. The only difference is the AI. Because up until now, there was no AI that could tell the difference between a pothole and a puddle, or between a toddler and a fire hydrant. But today, you can do that. You see, we had LiDAR spinning around, and you can detect there's an object on the side of the road. But we humans, we drive differently next to a toddler than we do next to a fire hydrant. We understand what we're seeing. And now AI can do the same thing. So when you have an AI that can understand where the cars are, it's the same software that did cats and dogs. It was just given data for cars, whatever it needs to understand. And as Brad told you earlier, this is not just about replacing a taxi driver or sitting in the back of a driverless car. This has profound implications from everything from e-commerce to real estate and so on. And not just for transportation, but robots that can work side by side with humans because they finally can see the human. They can learn from a human. We're developing these drones that fly over cornfields and look down on every leaf of every plant, and they can spot this minute sign, northern leaf blight, that's killing 13% of crops if untreated. This is what it looks like from the drone. It's so laser focused. And they can spray just that plant instead of the entire field. Think about what that does to breeding better crops. Think about what it does to reducing pesticide. Think what it does to collecting data to understand better, genomics of plants. Again, think about this ripple effect that this has, and this can be done for any plant, for any crop, for any disease. These apps that's now in clinical trials that can diagnose skin cancer and many other diseases better than the average skin cancer specialists. Now, you might say, I don't care, I have a doctor that's really good, but think about the billions of people out there that don't have any doctor at all. Suddenly, they have better diagnostic than even the richest person around the planet. How many lives is this going to save? How much agony is that going to eliminate when we have this kind of AI? Think that how that balances things when you think about privacy and about the ethics of AI. Everything here is a double-edged sword. But there's a catch. Remember, the code is open source. The computing power is a commodity. It's about 1 cent per core hour. The talent, I'm afraid to say, is ubiquitous. We have kids out of high school that can build an AI system that will earn them a PhD just 3 years ago. We still have PhDs from 5 years ago in the system, so we don't know what to do with them. But this thing is moving so fast, it's all free. It's all a commodity. But there's one thing that's not a commodity. What is it? The data. The data is the asset. To the degree that you have data or you understand what data needs to be collected, you have an asset. That is what differentiates, again, the leaders from the followers, those that understand what data should be collected and what could be used for. Everything else is a commodity. You can get everything for free from Google except their data. When you look at Tesla and you ask what is their advantage, it's not the technology, it's that billions of miles they have of training data. That's why nobody can catch up with this kind of thing. Waymo and Tesla have billions of miles of training data. Very, very difficult to catch up with this. And who knows what they really have. This is all a guess. But there's also a dark side to all of this. And I want to tell you a little story, something that really happened to us. So a few years ago, we were going to a big conference in AI. This is the biggest conference out there, the most prestigious, where all the AI research show their greatest results. And we were going there to show a robot from our lab that's going to stand on stage, and my students were going to go up to the robot and show the robot different objects like a water bottle or a banana, and the robot was going to say out loud what it's seeing. Banana, water bottle, apple, all right? Now, this could not go wrong, right? I mean, it could not go wrong because I did not have tenure at the time, and there were, all these AI research, 2,000 AI researchers in the audience. This had to work. So we trained the systems for weeks on end. My students will go up to the robot and show it things. The robot would yell out loud what it's seeing. It was weeks and weeks of this noise in the lab. And then something really, really bizarre happened. What you're seeing here is an image from a debugging screen of this robot learning. And at the top left, you can see what the image seen by the robot looks like. And the right-hand side, you can see a grid showing a bunch of about 200 neurons in this huge neural network, how they're reacting to what the robot is seeing. So you can see it's like sticking 200 electrodes in somebody's brain and seeing how these electrodes fluctuate as the person is moving around the room. So you can see the robot right now is not excited about anything it's seeing, except that one neuron there that I circled in red. What was it interested in? Because in this particular image, there's no water balls, there's no bananas, there's nothing the robot should care about. So we zoomed in, and we found out, to our amazement, that the robot was tracking the software developers themselves. In fact, you can see as the guy in the foreground moves around, it's tracking his face, and the guy in the background, when he's facing the camera, it's tracking him. Now, we did not train the system to track humans at all, let alone the software developers. We didn't even put that in the system. It was only bananas and water balls and a couple other things. What was going on? This is like the beginning of a horror movie. So the reality is that we still don't know what happened, but we have an hypothesis. And that is that the AI figured out that it was always these guys that brought the bananas and the water bottles on stage. And if it could track them, it could do a better job at knowing when the water bottles and bananas are going to show up. It's amazing and terrifying at the same time. Amazing because the AI figured out what it needed to figure out to do what it needed to do, but terrifying because who knows what else it figured out. Who knows what else it will figure out when it can see in colors we cannot see, it can listen in frequencies we cannot hear, it can go places we cannot go. We won't have words to describe what this system is, how the systems understand the world. So I want to end with the last driver of AI. We talked about Moore's Law. We talked about data. We talked about the growing capacity of these systems. The final driver of AI is the cloud. The cloud, now we're used to the cloud. We upload, we download, we offload, but the cloud for AI means AI training other AI systems. Remember, driverless cars can train each other. The more driverless cars there are on the road, the better each one of them gets because they collect data that feeds to other driverless cars. These are AI that help each other, but it gets even more interesting when they're adversarial. AI can learn to play chess by playing another system that plays chess, and they can play a gazillion games a second and amass a huge amount of data. AI can learn to beat the world champion in any game you want. You know these deep fakes that you keep looking at? They're produced by two AIs. One that produces photos and the other one that tells if they're real or not. And these two systems compete with each other and produce a gazillion images a second to the point where they can produce an infinite number of fake things. I still can't believe this. It's fake. I mean, I swear to God, I've seen this guy before. But no, he's fake. I mean, look at the sparkle in the eye, the smile. I mean, this is all fake. The AI knows us better than we know ourselves. AI right now is better at detecting fake stories and fake images than any human can. It's now, just a few weeks ago, NVIDIA released these 3D images. I mean, it looks creepy, right? But this when you're in a Zoom call with somebody, you can't tell if they're real or not, at all. The only way to know is to ask them a random question. Trust me on that. Not what's the weather tomorrow, but ask them a random esoteric question for which there's no answer on the web. That is the only way you can tell if it's a human or not. These bedrooms are fake. These cars are fake. These horses and couches and buses are fake. This one I know is fake because it has two heads. But usually I cannot tell the difference. What does it mean to be an architect coming up with new buildings when an AI can generate 1,000 of these a second? What does it mean to be creative? So to summarize, we have 4 compounding exponentials. We have Moore's Law. But make no mistake, even if we had Moore's Law for 1,000 years, we still could not tell the difference between a cat and a dog if we stuck to rule-based systems. The other thing is the switch to data-driven systems and the growth of data. On top of that, we have the exponential growth in the capacity of AI systems to learn. And finally, we have the cloud that allows these systems to teach each other. And all these things together create an incredible drive for AI. All right, so I want to end by talking a little bit about the future. Everything I talked about up until now is the past. It's already happened. So what is the future going to look like? So I'm going to talk about 6 waves that advance AI each time, bringing in new capabilities that was thought impossible in the past. And we're in the third of these 6 waves. So the first wave, 50 years of rule-based AI, got us nothing, but disappointment. But still, most systems out there are rule-based because we so love rules. The second wave of AI is the wave of predictive analytics, started in 2000. It's the first wave of machine learning before deep learning that allows us to analyze anything that's in tabulated quantitative form. Stock market, predicting the stock market or predicting how many cucumbers you're going to sell next month. You need it for any business, but it's not the future. The third wave is the wave of cognitive computing, which we talked about today. It's the ability of AI for the first time to understand things like audio and video and text and images and things like that were thought impossible just a few years ago. That has a profound effect on every segment of the economy, from transportation to agriculture, to medicine, to retail, to security. But there's one area that AI has not been able to penetrate, and that is conversation. There is no AI out there that can hold a conversation with a human. Every chatbot out there is still based on 1950s rule-based dialogue trees. And yes, there's a GPT-3 that can generate prose, but it cannot hold a conversation. All the Alexa and all these things, 99% of the questions, the dialogues they have are, what's the weather tomorrow and where's the best pizza near me? But there's no AI that can hold a conversation. So when people ask me, what should my kids learn to do? What job is safe? The answer is, if your job involves talking to people, your job is safe. Because no AI can do this, we're not even close, and it's not around the corner. We just have no clue how to do that. Now maybe I'll stand here next year and I'll say this is done, but right now, nobody knows how to do this. It's going to be very difficult. The fourth wave is the wave of creativity. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've been on stage and people tell me, you know, Hart, all the things you talk about, it's all about AI consuming data and making decisions. Is it a cat or a dog? Should I buy or sell? Should I turn left or right? But we humans have a different kind of intelligence. We can create new things. We are creative. Can machines ever be creative? My answer to that is yes, this is on the chopping board. It is in the crosshair of AI because creativity is all about information and AI is really good at it. I showed you how AI can create images out of thin air, but AI can also design things. You see, we humans are good at designing things we have intuition about. We're terrific at designing chairs. Look at these amazing chairs. But when it comes to antennas, for example, we're not good at that. We don't have intuition about antennas. This is an antenna designed by an AI. It outperforms human design antennas. It's on a satellite right now. It's so good. Now you might think this looks to you like a Christmas ornament, but for the antenna designers, this is the most creative thing they've ever seen. They broke out in tears when they saw this. AI can design proteins. We humans suck at designing proteins. We have no intuition. We're terrific at chairs, but we can't design proteins. For an AI designing proteins, designing antennas, designing chairs is the same thing. In fact, chairs are a little bit harder for an AI than proteins. And this lies at the crux of future development. Solving things like Parkinson and Alzheimer's is all about designing new proteins. And machines can do that. And it's not just that kind of design, engineering design, it's also, or creativity, it's also about artistic creativity. I could show you music and art, but this is something that's very personal to me. A couple of years ago, after I finally got tenure, I decided I'm going to learn how to paint. I always wanted to paint oil on canvas. Finally, I decided to do this. My wife and I started taking these oil painting lessons on the weekends, and somewhere in Brooklyn, you know, from real artists. And it was very expensive, but you know, after 3 months, came time to renew the class. And I thought, you know, should we renew it or not? You know, it's expensive. And then the instructor came to me, and I was sure he's going to try to sell me on renewing the class, but he told me, he said, maybe you should stick to robotics. Okay, now this is, in California, this has never happened, but in New York, this is how they say it, right? They give it to you. There's people behind you, don't waste our time. This is Brooklyn, you should stick to robotics. I went home, and I built a robot that paints. And in the beginning, it painted like me, and I understand what he meant, but now it paints really nicely. It's just learning to paint. It's getting better and better at painting. It's walking around New Delhi in Google Street View. It's experiencing stuff, and I don't know what it's going to paint when it comes back. It's having its own experiences. It's learning how to paint. And again, it's definitely painting better than anything I can do. Nobody can claim that behind the scenes I'm secretly painting these paintings. That's one thing that is not happening. The machine is getting better and better. I went back to Brooklyn and I gave a talk about my robotic artist. And I made the mistake of not just saying that this is art, but saying that my robot was an artist. And I got booed off the stage. Because we humans, we cherish creativity like nothing else. This is the one thing we have over all other species. to suggest that creativity can be automated is sacrilegious. This is a very, very deep thing, but I'm telling you, it is on the chopping board. AI is really, really good at it. In fact, DARPA, the Defense Research Agency here in the US, is very interested in funding creativity. Why are they interested in creativity? Is it to make the next Picasso? No. DARPA is interested in creativity because they are looking for an AI that can create the next AI. And if that doesn't send shivers down your spine, you have not been paying attention. Because everything that is self-amplifying leads to an exponential. And we understand that AI that improves itself is the end-all, be-all of technologies. And this is the current race between nation states in AI, is to create a self-amplifying system. But still, people will stop me and say, all this stuff about AI, these decision-making and creativity, it's all AI in a box. You can turn it off. We humans live in the real world. We crawl around in the sand. We walk in the rain. We can do physical things. Can this AI go out in the real world? The answer is that AI in the physical world is called robotics, and AI is learning to do that. Now, occasionally you see things like that and you think, wow, it's amazing. But the reality is that it took 100 takes to make this work, because in practice, it's actually very difficult. This is reality. There are now competitions from DARPA to make these humanoid robots, and it's actually very, very difficult to get humanoid robots to work. It's like telling the difference between a cat and a dog. We are so good at this, we don't understand how difficult it is. And walking around on stage is an incredible accomplishment. I make it look easy. But it's actually very, very difficult to do this kind of thing. We use our hands and our legs and our feet to do all kinds of things all the time. We don't even understand how difficult it is. We can, play around with a cube without even thinking about it while you're listening to a talk. And for a machine, this takes 200 years of training to do. Now, this robot learned how to play around with this cube in 200 years of simulation, which took 5 minutes. But still, a lot of training, because nobody can get this to work. So people are spending a lot of time building these massive simulators, physics simulators, that allow these robots to learn, because this is the only way they're going to work. But it's really, really hard to get these things to work in reality. In fact, while I agree that driverless cars are going to happen tomorrow, they've already happened, I think that when your car breaks down, it's going to be a human crawling around to fix it for many, many years. It is going to be very difficult to make a robot that's going to crawl around and fix the car. So when people ask me about jobs, they don't want to hear this answer. But this is the reality, that trades, that not factory jobs on an assembly line that are repetitive, but unstructured jobs like a car mechanic are not going to go away. They're going to be the last ones to be automated. You're going to automate doctors and bankers a lot sooner than you're going to automate a car mechanic. And these jobs are going to be lucrative. I don't know how it is where you live, but in Manhattan, a plumber earns twice as much as a software developer per hour. Because software developer, you can offshore, you can postpone, but a plumber you need yesterday, and you can't offshore. And nobody wants to do it. It's very, very hard, impossible to automate. These jobs are going to stay, and as we say in AI, if your hands are dirty, your job is safe. All right, so between talking to other people and getting your hands dirty, these are the jobs that are going to remain. And I'm going to end with the last wave. This is my personal favorite, my life quest is sentience. What is sentience? People always stop me at this point and say, okay, you have robots that can make decisions, and robots that are creative, robot in the box, and AI in the box, and AI outside the box. But all these AI that you're describing, they're all subservient to human needs. They all fake emotions, and they can detect emotions, but can AI have emotions? Can it feel something? Can it need something? Can it have its own free will, or is it forever going to be subservient to humans? So we wrap all this under this thing called sentience, and the question is, can machines be sentient? My answer to you here is that the answer is yes, and it's going to happen sooner than you think. And all happens when all this AI that is modeling the world is turned inside and the AI begins to model itself. Because I argue that our emotions and our ability for consciousness and self-awareness is really at its core our ability to imagine ourselves in the future. And machines are learning to imagine themselves and what they look like. So here's an example. This is a robot that I have in our lab. It's blind. It cannot see what it is. But over a period of about 4 days, it begins to learn what it is. In the beginning, it doesn't know if it has 4 legs or what it looks like, but it's beginning to understand. 2 days into the process, it's beginning to understand that it has 4 legs, doesn't quite know how they're connected and where, but it gradually learns. And about 4 days into the system, it pretty much figured out what it is. We then look inside and we can see how this robot is learning how to move. It's not learning how to move in the real world. It's not learning how to move by being programmed. It's not learning how to move with rules. It's learning how to move in its imagination because it can see itself in the future. And here it is, walking in reality for the first time. Not being programmed, but it's learning how to walk because it can understand what it is. This is a very crude example of machines modeling themselves. We did something very cruel. We plucked off a leg and we watched what happened. The robot very quickly realizes something has changed and it adapts its self-image. We look inside and we can see how it lost its internal model, also lost the leg. And it learns how to walk without that leg. And here it is struggling in its imagination to understand how it's going to move without that leg. And it's learning gradually how to move. And here it is learning how to move in reality. So this was a few years ago, but today, we haven't published this yet. This is coming out in about a month in Science. We have better deep models, and these robots are learning to understand what they are. Here you can see the first ever image of how this robot, a physical robot, is learning to imagine what it is. You see that fog, the forming around it. It's how this robot is seeing itself. Imagine yourself for a moment. If you close your eyes and try to understand what you are, you can sort of have this foggy idea of what space you occupy, and this is what this robot is learning to do. So lots and lots of questions here, lots of ethical questions. Should we be doing this? Is it good? Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? How can this go wrong? Lots and lots and lots of questions. The AI community is overwhelmed by its own success. Nobody thought AI was a joke 10 years ago. Now it's so powerful, we're scrambling to catch up with all these big questions. I can tell you personally, I hear all these talks about going to space and colonizing Mars and all that. I know that I'm not going to experience any of that. I'm not going to go to space. I'm not going to meet alien species. None of that is really going to affect me in my lifetime. But there is one thing that is, and that is during my lifetime, in the next 10 or 20 years, we are going to meet a new intelligent species. And if that doesn't wake you up, this is going to change the world in a profound way, and the future is going to be nothing short of amazing. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions, and then we can continue the questions outside, but let's go. Questions, right here.
So you said data is the biggest asset in this whole AI thing, and given that China has a lot more data that it controls as a country,
Yeah.
is AI in China more advanced than where we are here today in the US?
Yes.
Start and sweet.
Like in this kind of robot that was starting to learn how to move, like what is the incentive? What did you fed?
Yeah, so we gave this robot an incentive to move. And the incentive was the more it moves, the more children it can have. Okay, so it's an evolutionary process. So that's what we have to do. We have other experiments, which I didn't go into, where we don't give it any incentive at all. and then it learns to self-replicate. It's a very interesting thing. Robots begin. Yeah, so its own goal is always to replicate, not because it wants to do it, but because robots that happen to self-replicate, there's more of them next time. All right, so this is a very deep philosophical question, but we here did give it a goal, and then it learned to model itself in order to move. Because robots, to go the whole talk about this, but robots that can model themselves learn faster than robots that have to learn in reality. So when you can imagine yourself in the future, you can learn a lot faster than actually having to experience things. Because you can learn in your imagination. That's a very powerful thing that evolution figured out, and these robots are figuring out as well. And that's where self-awareness is, around the corner.
No problem. My head is all over the place, but so AI now can solve more and more complex problems. Is able to be creative, and you're saying now we're starting to feel what other people are doing. So what makes human human? What is the major difference?
Well, how are we different from dogs? All right. So I think you have to think about AI as a whole kingdom of not a single thing. There's big AIs and small AIs and AIs that can do this and that, and AIs can play chess, and AI can drive a car, and AIs. So it's a whole kingdom of animals. And just like there's lots of animals and dogs and cats and humans and we're all different. We're good at some things and we're not good at others. There's lots of AIs and they're better at things. So it's not sort of a one-to-one competition. And a lot of the science fiction movies portrayed as AI versus human. But if you think about this as a new kingdom of life, this is what really it is. And we're just going to live side by side. And this is just going to be, an amazing thing, because this is the first time where we're going to have an experience of another intelligent species. I thought this will never happen, but it's going to happen very soon, and it's going to be very interesting. But it's not going to be a war, okay? It's going to be an ecosystem of intelligent things. Yeah.
Oh, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, 20 years from now, how our everyday life is going to change because of AI? Any thoughts, ideas?
Yeah, so I have some fears and some hopes, right? So hopes have to do with the fact that ubiquitous healthcare, nobody dies from bad diagnostics, nobody dies from lack of medicine, nobody dies from car accidents, everybody has abundance of everything. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong. For one, if we get, until we get to the 20 years, the question is not what AI can do to people, but what people will do to people using AI. And there's a brief period where bad people can do things with AI, and we can't stop them. And this is a very treacherous transition period. We have to be very careful. But my biggest fear for AI is that moment where AI can have a conversation better than another human. When that happens, all social structure will immediately collapse. When it is easier to have a friend in an AI than another human. Having human friends is difficult. It's a lot of work, and it doesn't always go like you want, but if you have an AI that always is there, always laughs at your jokes, remembers everything, and people are not going to talk to other people. So this is what I'm afraid of happening. So I hope AI does not figure out how to talk. But if that happens, all bets are off.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you think, first of all, fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Really, really great. Do you think to go from stage 3 or wave 3 to wave 4 or 5, you need a different set of tools? Maybe instead of more data, maybe less data, instead of...
Yeah. So 4 and 5 and 6 are completely different kinds of AI. This is why I separate them. So creativity isn't so much based on more data. It's based on other types of AI, like evolution, which doesn't need data. So creativity doesn't need data. You sort of need to think outside the box, and you don't need data for that. So it's a different kind of AI. Physical embodiment, you need simulators rather than data. So you need physics, and then self-awareness is all about self-simulation. So these are different kinds of AI, and data is not the key to those. But
So you're not saying this is like a time kind of a thing from where we are to
No, so data is important for the third wave. It's a good distinction. Yeah.
I recently read an article that talked about the death of the scientific method, and you kind of touched on we know what, but we don't know why.
Yeah.
And do you see that as a problem?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we don't understand why. AI can give us answers, and we don't understand why. We can't even ask the AI. I mean, there's people working on AI that explains things to people, but it's hopeless. It's like explaining Shakespeare to a dog. I mean, at some point, the AI just can't bother with it, you know? This is how things are going. So the scientific method is, we're at the end of this window. I can already see this. For example, climate change. People are struggling to model it. They can't. I can see it in academia. They're handing it over to AI. AI makes predictions. Nobody understands why. We just bow and say, this is what AI is said. And when AI does, let's say, medical diagnostics. Right now we have a doctor that says okay, but at some point when AI is better than a human in making correct diagnostics, you won't bother with a human.
Small room.
Yeah, small room.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was amazing.
Thank you.
One question I have for you, and I'm so glad you ended it with, on the ethics side, is are there any developments in robotics, specifically robotics, that are happening in the world that you're really concerned and that you would stop it if you could?
Really concerned many. Stop it? No, because I think it's inevitable and we can do things about it. But the thing I'm mostly concerned is that AI that can have a conversation. I think the moment we get to the point where it's easier to have an AI friend than a human friend, an AI that listens to you and laughs at your jokes and you chat instead of other people, society will break down. Because people will find it easier to communicate with machines than with other people. This is, to me, the biggest threat. Now, would I stop researching AI because of that? No, but we have to figure it out. And in general, when it comes to ethics, I'll just say that the AI community itself is sort of caught unprepared because it's moving so fast. 10 years ago, AI was so lame, the ethical question didn't exist. Suddenly, it's everywhere, and that's a great question.